Tonight on Four Corners, the inside story of the world's biggest ecstasy bust and how the mafia rebuilt its roots in Australia.
Here we are some 30 to 40 years later, the same families involved in major drugs still from that time.
You will have the baton passed essentially from father to son, from father to nephew, and they will continue to use those very strong family links and will take over essentially the family business.
The links are there, the links are tight, and they are based on the one thing that keeps all the Ndrangheta clans together, which is blood ties.
The Calabrian mafia's tentacles have a long, deep reach within Australia. You'll see tonight how one of those tentacles was cut off after an extensive cloak and dagger sting operation against the mafia's most powerful Australian drug lord. For the first time, we can now recount in gripping detail just how the police busted the network. You'll hear the villains condemn themselves with their own words. We also detail how reporter Nick McKenzie found himself at the centre of an extraordinary attempt by second-generation mafia boss Pat Barbaro to flush out the police operation, an action that finally put him and many associates behind bars. But with a massive bankroll at its disposal, the Ndrangheta, or honoured society, has simply regrouped, and today it's business as usual, with yet another generation of leaders and an ongoing web of influence through Australia's public institutions, including our parliaments. In the second strand of our Four Corners and Fairfax Media joint investigation, Nick McKenzie identifies two of those alleged leaders and throws further light on Ndrangheta's political clout.
In the darkness of an August night in 2008, heavily armed federal police launched a series of sweeping raids across the country. The raids were the climax to one of the most ambitious organised crime investigations in Australian history. They targeted one of the world's most secretive and powerful international mafia organisations, the Calabrian Ndrangheta, or honoured society.
The Calabrian Mafia in Australia is the longest running crime organisation that we've ever had. It's been continuously operating for nearly 93 years now, and looks as though it's going to go for another 100.
There's no question that the Calabrian Mafia, or the Ndrangheta as they're also known, are a global enterprise, and certainly what we saw during this investigation was exactly that this was they had a global reach.
The story of this enormous Australian police operation started in June 2007 with the discovery on Melbourne's wharves beyond all expectations.
At the time of the seizure, it was the largest seizure of ecstasy in the world, and some 15 million tablets were actually seized by the police.
We're talking about 4.4 tonnes of ecstasy, an enormous value of drugs. We're talking about $500 million worth of ecstasy.
The drugs had been carefully hidden inside a consignment of canned tomatoes imported from Italy. Federal police secretly seized the drugs and then put the container back on the wharf, hoping to arrest whoever showed up to collect it. As the shipping container sat unclaimed on the dock, the suspected drug plotters gathered at this Melbourne hotel. They didn't know their hotel room had been bugged by the federal police. As police listened in via a hidden microphone in their 6th floor room, it soon became clear the suspects feared a trap.
If there's cameras there, if it's flat, it'll be fucking 24/7, so Atlas will be nothing to do. Oh mate, that's 20 million fucking dollars just fucking watching that one fucking way with someone thinking.
As days became weeks, with no one arriving to claim the shipment, lead investigator, Detective Superintendent Matt Warren, feared something had gone wrong.
Your emotions are up and down. You know, you've got that constant expectation that someone will come and that you'll get a result. And when that's looking less and less likely, without question, it's disheartening.
Police soon realised why no one had come to collect the container. Due to a clerical mix-up, the drug importers never got the phone call to confirm their shipment had arrived. They had no idea if their container had been lost, stolen or seized.
The number, we would allege, on the paperwork was a false phone that would go to the criminal syndicate, and they would redirect the container to a warehouse under their control. Well, of course, that didn't occur for them. They never received the call. So you had quite a strange situation with a container purporting to be full of drugs sitting in a freight forwarder's yard and no one going anywhere near it.
I think in the short term it looked like a setback to the investigators, because obviously at the start of this investigation they were just probably hoping for a quick result where the criminals would come and pick up the container and they'd move in and arrest them. So initially it looked like a setback, and that meant the investigation had to run quite a lot longer.
In fact, it was a turning point, and it allowed us to go from arresting some of the lower level suspects to move up the chain and take out some of the probably the highest profile organised crime figures in Australia.
The men police had under surveillance were suspected members of Australia's most notorious mafia cells. The man at the centre of the group was a New South Wales mafia boss called Pasquale Pat Barbaro. Barbaro appeared to be the man calling the shots.
He was issuing directives to people in terms of what was to happen within the business. He was very hands-on. I think he was in the detail of this business. He certainly wasn't a hands-off manager. I think the evidence very much revealed him to be very busy, very active, hard-working.
And what we saw was a man who was driven. He was energetic. He would drive their operations. He was very much a leader.
As the suspects discussed what had gone wrong with their shipment, their hotel room conversations were being monitored on a police listening bug. It recorded members of the group discussing whether to storm the Port of Melbourne to find their missing drugs.
I don't know what control they have over the fucking docks there. It's routine. Pull you on the map and just say, this is the crane drive on the side. If I could pitch it up with somebody back outside. See? There's no harm down there. No one's harm.
For the criminals, they were madly scrambling to try and locate the container, because at that point it had gone missing. And certainly it became very clear to them, although they weren't able to confirm that the container had been intercepted.
The listening bug also revealed associates of Pat Barbaro describing his growing fears that either police or another criminal syndicate had seized his drugs.
That's a fucking devastating. It's fucking shock. What he's got to realise now, he's got to realise that he's pinched the drugs.
Our view was that if we continued to investigate them, they would need to talk about the fact that they had not received these pills, that they had lost. They're talking about a huge financial blow to a syndicate. There would be a lot of people who would be owed a lot of money. There'd be a lot of people who would have had an expectation of receiving a lot of money out of this. So therefore, people need to talk, they need to discuss. And that was where we were hoping that we would start to gather some evidence of what had occurred. What I'm saying to you is this is most likely the trafficking.
Police believed if they followed Pat Barbaro, he could lead them into the heart of the secret operations of the Calabrian Mafia. The investigation soon headed to Barbaro's hometown of Griffith in New South Wales, the historical epicentre of the Ndrangheta in Australia.
Certainly in the early stages of his life, he was convicted over a cultivation of marijuana plants, and that's fairly common in the Griffith area. We've seen historically the Calabrian Mafia involved in marijuana crop growing in that sort of New South Wales area, that Griffith general area.
In the 1950s, thousands of Italian migrants came to Australia to seek new lives. Many honest families from the mountain villages of Calabria were drawn to the rich farmland around Griffith in the New South Wales Riverina district. In the decades that followed, a small number of Calabrian migrants began amassing unexplained wealth.
They lived a life that was quite separate to the traditional Griffith resident, in that they were building big homes. If it was a dry period, it didn't seem to worry them. They still had the money. They didn't do it tough like many of the farmers and others in Griffith were doing it, and it caused a lot of concern, and I can understand why.
In the 1970s, Donald Mackay, a local furniture shop owner and political candidate, began campaigning for police action against local farmers suspected of secretly growing marijuana. After police busted a huge local marijuana crop, Mackay suddenly became a marked man. In 1977, he disappeared after leaving a local pub.
When these crops were seized, he was blamed for it. That's what caused his murder. He had cost the Calabrian Mafia too much money. It was time to stop. If we can get rid of Donald Mackay, we can get back to growing the crops. That was the simple logic of it. And he appears to have been shot as he was attempting to unlock the car.
Former New South Wales Assistant Police Commissioner Clive Small spent years investigating the Calabrian Mafia.
There was some blood found on the ground here, near the car. There were 3 spent shells, suggesting he'd been shot 3 times. And the keys to the car were on the ground. So that was the last that was seen of him leaving the hotel. Never been found to this day.
Griffith's Calabrian Mafia cell had a powerful avenue of political influence through the local federal Labor MP, Al Grasby. When Grasby visited Calabria as Immigration Minister in 1974, he was treated to a hero's welcome.
I am aware, while he was the Immigration Minister, there were a number of people who got visas and were able to stay in Australia who were of highly questionable character, and I think any reasonable look at them would raise questions about why was that done if it wasn't done for corrupt purposes. I don't think there's any question that Al Grasby was significantly corrupt. His attempts after the Donald Mackay murder to move the blame away from the real killers and make suggestions that Donald Mackay's wife and others were involved in the murder was disgraceful, and I don't think any man with any sort of decency could justify that.
Responding to the public outcry over Mackay's disappearance, the New South Wales government set up a royal commission headed by Justice Woodward to investigate drug trafficking networks.
What's the lighting here?
Clive Small was one of the commission's investigators.
The Woodward Royal Commission was extremely important in 2 ways. It really opened up the story about the Mackay murder, and in doing that it also opened up the story about the Calabrian Mafia in Australia.
Among the men investigated was a local farmer, Frank Barbaro, nicknamed Little Trees for the new orchards he'd planted.
Well, Frank Littletrees Barbaro was at the core of what you call the Calabrian Mafia group in Griffith. He was one of the first to be growing substantial crops, and he was one of the first, Woodward found, to have significant additional and unexplained flows of money.
This is money from the
money
marijuana?
Coming from the marijuana crops.
Okay. Frank Littletrees Barbaro had a son he named Pasquale, but who everyone else called Pat. Pat Barbaro learned the family trade.
Pat Barbaro is clearly one of those people that we hear about being classic mafia. That is, he's born into the family, which is already a significant part of the Calabrian Mafia or a family clan. So he's been born into the Calabrian Mafia, into one of the head families.
Certainly, what we see with this is what we've seen historically with the Ndrangheta, that you will have the baton passed essentially from father to son, from father to nephew, and that they will continue to use those very strong family links and will take over essentially the family business.
Pat Barbaro took over his father's business, expanding it from cannabis crops to drug importation.
Here is Justice Woodward in the 1970s warned the federal and state governments and the law enforcement about this threat involving these people. And here we are some 30 to 40 years later, the same families involved in major drugs still from that time. And if you look at Pasquale Barbaro's history, he'd been involved in drugs almost all his life.
Clive Small says that the Woodward Royal Commission's recommendations to launch a long-term anti-mafia campaign were ignored. Soon the mafia faded from public view.
Well, we've had for 16 years a denial that there is such a mafia in Australia, and I think that's part of the problem. If we had admitted that we had a problem with the Calabrian mafia, the public would be screaming for us to do something about it. If we say it doesn't exist, then we don't have to do anything because there's nothing to respond to. And I think that's the problem. That's been hidden from the public because it's too big a political problem.
According to a secret 2003 National Crime Authority report obtained by Four Corners, police had for several years been confidentially warning that Pat Barbaro was part of a powerful Australian Calabrian mafia network. This network had infiltrated members into or recruited people from public organisations, government and law enforcement. One of Barbaro's criminal associates had even allegedly paid off judges, costing approximately $2.2 million. Barbaro himself was suspected of using the profits obtained from cannabis cultivation to finance the importation of drugs from overseas.
Certainly by late 2006, early 2007, we were well aware of his prominence and that he was extraordinarily active in international crime.
If you have a look at his history, he's been involved in crops in New South Wales, in Queensland, that's cannabis, but then he seems to have moved into other drugs, be it amphetamines, ecstasy and the like.
By early 2007, police were investigating Pat Barbaro over several drug importations. The biggest of them was the world record ecstasy shipment that had arrived in Melbourne from Italy in June 2007, and which Barbaro had been unable to locate.
This was a continuation of a number of investigations that were occurring. The AFP were investigating and had investigated Pat Barbaro over a number of years. He was alleged to have been involved in a number of drug importations, and we saw him as a major organised crime figure at the time.
After secretly seizing the drugs, police then shifted the focus of their investigation to Italy, the source of the shipment. Four Corners travelled to Calabria, in Italy's deep south, the traditional home of the Ndrangheta.
The Ndrangheta in Calabria and Ndrangheta in Australia are tight, really tight. Even if they migrated 50 years ago, they still are very connected, even in a nostalgic way, to the motherland, which is Calabria. So the links are there, the links are tight, and they are based on the one thing that keeps all the Ndrangheta clans together, which is blood ties. The most common thing that can happen is that someone refuses.
Dr. Anna Sergi is a Calabrian mafia expert who studied the group's links to Australia.
The Barbaro family is one of the oldest mafia families in Calabria. The Barbaro surname is a guarantee for if you want to access certain drug routes, if you want to be involved in certain cross-transnational business.
In July 2007, 1 month after the massive drug shipment had disappeared in Melbourne, Pat Barbaro flew to Calabria. When he arrived in the capital, Italian surveillance operatives working with the AFP were waiting and watching. They tailed Barbaro as he met several known Calabrian mafia figures linked to the ecstasy shipment. The police who trailed Barbaro work with anti-mafia prosecutor Roberto De Palma.
La circostanza che Pasquale Barbaro, venuto in Italia, abbia avuto i contatti con esponenti di altre famiglie, dimostra che la famiglia Barbaro è una famiglia assolutamente di primaria importanza nel panorama criminale. Ma dimostra anche un altro fatto, cioè che questi viaggi, che c'è la necessità in fondo di potersi vedere, perché la tecnologia che tanto ha aiutato e ci aiuta in questo villaggio globale che ormai è tutto il nostro globo terrestre, ha aiutato paradossalmente anche i contatti di carattere illecito. E però, ciò nonostante, vi sono determinati argomenti di carattere strategico, di carattere generale, che debbono essere ragionati di persona, no?
Italian police identified another Australian, allegedly working with Barbaro in Calabria, Adelaide construction industry figure Paul Alvaro. Italian police files allege that Paul Alvaro was assisting Pat Barbaro with his drug trafficking enterprise, a claim Alvaro strongly denies.
Sì, la famiglia Alvaro è una delle famiglie di 'Ndrangheta più importanti, ma non solo la famiglia Alvaro, ma anche esempio la famiglia Barbaro è molto presente in Australia. La 'Ndrangheta è molto presente in Australia non solo ad esempio nella produzione di marijuana, ma anche nel traffico di cocaina e anche nell'occupazione della cosa pubblica.
In Calabria, Barbaro's explanation to his mafia bosses about why their drug shipment was missing did not go down well.
Barbaro flew to Europe to meet with the syndicate heads, and by this stage we'd established that there was an enormous debt that was owed and that he would have to pay the bill, or he would be probably held accountable, and within that type of group, the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian organised crime, we would expect that he potentially would suffer the ultimate consequences.
You mean he would be killed?
Yeah, there could potentially be a contract taken out on him.
On Barbaro's return to Melbourne, police continued to watch and record his every move. He was getting increasingly desperate. In this surveillance video, police believe Barbaro was threatening a criminal he suspected of stealing his drugs from the docks.
Certainly there's some friction, and as pressure starts to mount, as disappointment starts to mount, we can certainly see fractions within the group and certainly some bickering, and this is brought about by the enormous pressure that they're under for this to be successful.
Barbaro and his fellow criminals suspected they were being watched and began to engage in elaborate counter-surveillance measures.
Their conversations over the phone or via text message were often cryptic and coded. They would often speak in public areas, for example, parks. Also, this particular group of criminals changed their SIM cards over regularly, so that if they thought their phones were being bugged, they would basically just get rid of that phone and move on to another phone.
Barbaro was determined to find out what had happened to his massive drug shipment. So he made a risky move and reached out to a journalist.
In September 2007, I received a phone call from a block number. The man on the other end asked me if I wanted to report on the world's biggest drug shipment. I didn't know it then, but that man was Pat Barbaro, and he wanted me to confirm that the drugs had been seized by police, and then to report this so it could be read by his bosses back in Calabria.
Using a mobile phone registered in a false name, Pat Barbaro sent a series of text messages to spur me into action. The texts were detailed, describing, among other things, the number of pills in the ecstasy drug shipment. Sensing something sinister was afoot, I reported nothing. So a desperate Barbaro sent more and more information. Neither he nor I realised this would later prove crucial to the police case.
Looking at the historical metadata of the phones that had been purchased, we were able actually to put those mobile phones in Barbaro's hand. And those phones sent text messages that were tantamount to a confession.
The SMS messages with you showed that Barbaro had critical knowledge of the contents of that container. He knew exactly what was in the container and he was able to convey that to you in those SMS text messages. So that was a terrific link for the prosecution to have in this particular matter.
In early 2008, Barbaro began to organise new drug deals to raise the cash to pay off the debt from his botched importation.
Certainly within months, the Barbaro syndicate were back in business. They had access to 1.2 million ecstasy tablets, which seemed to originate from Sydney. And really the sale of that 1.2 million ecstasy tablets was then used to pay down the debt to the European suppliers for that missed importation. So very quickly they had regrouped, and obviously their business model was such that they were able to sustain a massive hit to their bottom line.
As police kept watching, Barbaro began leading them to other mafia bosses. These surveillance photos show Barbaro meeting his drug-dealing partner, notorious Melbourne gangster Frank Modafferi. Police suspected Modafferi had invested in the massive ecstasy importation.
Modafferi was a buyer of ecstasy tablets from Barbaro. Barbaro had a number of people who really, I suppose, were wholesalers and distributors of his ecstasy tablets, and Modafferi was one of those persons.
In 2008, police observed Pat Barbaro and his associates meeting up with greengrocer Frank Modafferi near his suburban fruit shop.
What's now? What's now?
Barbaro handed Modafferi boxes, which police suspected contained drugs.
Ultimately, we were able to prove that Modafferi trafficked in around 57,000 ecstasy pills for Barbaro, valued at between, I think, about $1.2 and $2.2 million.
Like Barbaro, Frank Modafferi's roots were back in Calabria, where he'd racked up a serious criminal record before sneaking into Australia on a tourist visa in 1989. Last week, Four Corners revealed how Frank Modafferi used an extraordinary network of political donors, including his brother Tony Modafferi, to lobby politicians to overturn a deportation order. Frank Modafferi was allowed to stay in Australia, despite Victoria police warning he was a dangerous mafia figure.
Clearly he served an apprenticeship, and a fairly violent one, in Italy before he came to Australia. Well, I think he's a significant figure. He's been involved for a very long time.
By 2008, Frank Modafferi was busy trafficking drugs supplied by Pat Barbaro. He was also issuing threats to other drug dealers who owed him money.
Ma che feci? Sull'anima mia mamma. Io non ti chiedo quadrati, io muccione e guidiamo quando vanno con i quadrati se una roba. E già se detti cose da ciuccipi. E ci dici che un profitto voglio io. Non è tu fa che ne sai, se no sei mai giocando rosso.
The mafia syndicate used this apartment in the Melbourne suburb of Carlton as a safe house to run their drug operation.
Certainly, once we identified that Barbaro was going to rent an apartment or a townhouse in Carlton, we were really excited about that, because finally we really saw ourselves getting ahead of the game. We could actually be a part of the conversation, so we could listen in and we could hear what they were planning.
Federal police agents waited until Pat Barbaro had left the apartment before sneaking inside, planting several audio bugs and cameras. The AFP began watching and listening as Barbaro, speaking in code, discussed massive drug deals involving Frank Modafferi and other mafia figures.
What's still like?
The bug picked up Barbaro reviewing his books of account. He kept quite comprehensive books of account which related to the drug trafficking business, and that would list customers and the amount of pills that had been sold to them and the amount of money that was owed to him. So both the camera and the listening device in that unit provided very compelling evidence.
In August 2008, after months of surveillance work, the federal police team headed by Matt Warren had finally gathered enough evidence to step out of the shadows and move against the mafia bosses. In the pre-dawn darkness, heavily armed police massed at assembly points in Griffith, New South Wales, Melbourne and Adelaide, knowing some of their targets were unpredictable, armed and dangerous. At the Carlton safe house, police found these handguns buried in the garden. Inside Pat Barbaro's Griffith mansion, police found guns, drugs and cash, along with a Scarface poster.
This is part of a global international syndicate. This is a major disruption to transnational organised crime both in this country and abroad. For the AFP, in our 30-year history, this is the largest operation we've ever undertaken.
The allegation that you, Francesco Mataferi, trafficked a substance, the substance being MDMA, and that the quantity trafficked was a commercial quantity. Do you understand that?
Ha capito questa accusa che le fanno? Yes, I understand.
What can you tell me about that allegation?
Cosa ci sa spiegare? I don't know anything about this bullshit.
When he was formally interviewed by police after his arrest, Frank Madafri denied any involvement with Pat Barbaro's drug syndicate.
I'm trying to establish whether you owe Pasquale Barbaro $32,000.
$32,000.
No.
No.
No, you don't.
Lei ha mai acquistato delle sostanze di droga da Pasquale Barbaro? No.
Frank Madafri chose to fight his drug charges. Late last year, he was convicted and received a 7-year prison sentence. Overwhelmed by the evidence against him, Pat Barbaro pleaded guilty and was jailed for 30 years over his role in the massive ecstasy shipment. At final count, 32 mafia figures and their criminal associates were convicted for drug dealing and money laundering.
There was an importation of 100 kilos of cocaine worth $40 million. There was a conspiracy to import 100 kilos of pseudoephedrine. There was trafficking in a further 1.2 million ecstasy pills and a very sophisticated money laundering operation as well, where they turned over about $10 million.
Detective Superintendent Matt Warren and his federal police team may have smashed the syndicate behind the massive 2007 drug shipment. But the Calabrian Mafia's secretive network remains in place within Australia, able to rebuild its operations quickly.
I think that's the key to these groups. They are able to regroup, rebound after suffering, in this case, a loss that would end most organised crime syndicates. And they've had this in the past where they've suffered defeats at the hands of law enforcement. But through those family connections, they're able to rebuild.
Political influence is a key factor in the Mafia's resilience. For decades, the Mafia has been building support on both sides of politics.
Well, certainly we've seen over the years that organised crime figures will try and cultivate people of all walks of life, but particularly people with influence. We certainly see organised crime figures cultivating sporting stars. It's no different with political figures. They're looking to try and gain influence and gain power and use that towards potentially diverting attention away from themselves.
Even after he was arrested, Frank Madafri cultivated political contacts.
Councillor wasn't on.
Victorian Labor Party delegate Michael Tetty has previously worked in the state ALP head office, as well as for federal MP Kelvin Thompson. These days, Tetty is an ALP councillor at Moreland City Council in Melbourne.
They misused our money under your watch.
Four Corners has established that Tetty spent months doing Frank Madafri's banking and running his fruit business at the same time Madafri was facing drug charges. While there is no suggestion Tetty was involved in drug trafficking, he allegedly supplied a gun to one of Frank Madafri's mafia henchmen. Tetty was later found guilty of carrying a loaded gun in a public place and placed on a good behaviour bond. Four Corners can also reveal that another Frank Madafri associate worked in the office of then Labor Senator Mehmet Tillam. This Madafri associate is currently facing criminal charges over a violent bashing. He got his job in the Labor Senator's office with the help of Michael Tetty. There is no suggestion that Mehmet Tillam knew that either Michael Tetty or the man he employed were associates of Frank Madafri.
I'll cut straight to the chase. Does any political figure have any business working, associating with someone like Francesco Madafri?
I would suggest that you would need to be very careful in dealings with Francesco Madafri.
As Four Corners revealed last week, Frank Madafri's brother, Tony, also has powerful political connections, despite his criminal associations. In 2008, federal police agents observed Tony Madafri meeting Pat Barbaro and other drug traffickers on several occasions, including this gathering in the middle of a park. Tony Modafferi has never been charged with any crime and denies any wrongdoing.
What did the AFP allege to the court about the relationship between Pasquale Barbaro and Tony Modafferi?
Well, I think the allegation that we put in court and the court documents would show that they were quite close, for sure, that there was a strong association between them.
In 2013, Tony Modafferi hosted a Liberal Party fundraiser at the Stocklands Reception Centre, part owned by his drug trafficking brother, Frank. The guest speaker was State Liberal Senior Minister Matthew Guy, who is now the Victorian opposition leader. Matthew Guy was unaware he was at an event hosted by an accused mafia figure, but other Liberal figures in the room, including federal MP Russell Broadbent, knew of Modafferi's alleged mafia connections.
I can't believe our politicians are so dopey that, having known the allegations, that they continue to accept money from a fundraiser. I find that so extremely difficult to understand how they could do it, or how they could be so naive.
Victoria's Police Commissioner has made his own assessment of Tony Modafferi, recently banning him from Melbourne's Crown Casino over his alleged mafia connections.
What was your reaction when the Victorian Chief Police Commissioner banned Tony Modafferi from Crown Casino?
I wasn't surprised by that.
Why not?
Well, I think, once again, we see him as potentially someone who associates and has close associations with established organised crime figures, and they're not really the people that the Chief Commissioner wanted in the casino environment.
The mafia has allegedly infiltrated every layer of government. Tony Vallelonga is the former mayor of Stirling in Perth. In 2011, the news broke that Italian anti-mafia prosecutors wanted to question Vallelonga over his alleged dealings in Calabria with a notorious mafia boss. Vallelonga faced the media with his family and lawyer to vehemently deny the allegations.
It's hurting me very much. It is very distressing. At 64, to get this sort of, what I call, campaign against me. That's all it is.
The worst that can be said, assuming it was admitted, and it's not, is that Mr Vallelonga has spoken or had contact with Italian mafia figures. Now, firstly, that's denied. We don't know which figures they are talking about.
Four Corners has learned that Italian prosecutors recently made far more detailed allegations in court about Tony Vallelonga. They allege he is an Australian mafia boss with the role of leader within his locale or mafia cell in Perth. Prosecutors allege that as part of this role, Vallelonga is responsible for making the most important decisions, for imparting orders or imposing sanctions on other subordinate associates. In a statement to Four Corners, Tony Vallelonga's lawyer said any allegation the former mayor has ever been involved in criminal activity is completely without any foundation. The Calabrian Mafia remains the dominant force in global drug trafficking. Just 3 weeks ago, Italian and Spanish police teamed up with the US Drug Enforcement Agency to launch a series of dramatic raids from the air, sea and land. Police seized tons of cocaine and arrested dozens of Calabrian Mafia figures. Despite the success, the Italian prosecutor who oversaw the operation says the Ndrangheta's global networks are as strong as ever.
È un colpo durissimo, però noi abbiamo bloccato oggi un'organizzazione, ma ci sono tante organizzazioni di questo livello, di questo target, che stanno operando mentre noi stiamo parlando.
Some of the suspects arrested in Calabria were members of the Italian Alvaro mafia clan. Prosecutor Nicola Gratteri says the Alvaros have a powerful cell operating in Australia.
La famiglia Alvaro è una delle famiglie di 'Ndrangheta più importanti, presenti già dalla fine dell'Ottocento nel panorama criminale, ma penso che la 'Ndrangheta sia molto presente in Australia e che il contrasto non è adeguato, visto che queste famiglie stanno crescendo sempre più, sono sempre più forti.
One of the alleged Alvaro clan bosses in Australia is Paul Alvaro. Paul Alvaro was the man police suspected of helping Pat Barbaro import drugs into Australia back in 2007. Italian police files allege Paul Alvaro has, like Pat Barbaro, risen to become a top Ndrangheta figure, allegedly involved in international drug trafficking. But this was never proven, and Alvaro strongly denies any involvement in mafia activity. His only criminal conviction dates back to 1990, when he was jailed for tax offences.
The prosecution alleged the Alvaros lived grand lifestyles on the lowest of declared incomes, and that they were involved in the trafficking of marijuana.
In Calabria, where people have long endured a political system deeply infiltrated by the mafia, prosecutor Roberta De Palma has a warning for Australian authorities.
Il pericolo maggiore è fare il gioco dell''ndrangheta, cioè permettere all''ndrangheta di potersi espandere, di poter avere sempre maggiori campi di azione, sempre maggiori infiltrazioni, soprattutto in quel tessuto direttivo dirigenziale dello Stato. E poi lì diventa molto più difficile riuscire logicamente ad intervenire, perché le decisioni politiche talvolta potrebbero, io parlo in termini teorici, potrebbero addirittura essere strumento dei piani della stessa 'ndrangheta.
Anti-mafia prosecutor Nicola Gratteri says that with police worldwide now focused on terrorism, Australia cannot afford to be complacent about the hidden tentacles of the Calabrian mafia.
Io penso che il problema mafie, il problema 'ndrangheta, è un problema che deve riguardare l'Australia, e di non misurare la presenza o la forza dell''ndrangheta o delle mafie in genere dal numero dei morti ammazzati per strada o gli spari e le serrande. Capire chi rifornisce i locali di divertimento, le discoteche, i pub, chi li rifornisce di cocaina, da dove arriva questa cocaina, chi la controlla, perché dove arriva cocaina e chi fa arrivare la cocaina poi con quegli stessi soldi, con i guadagni di quei soldi, compra tutti gli immobili in vendita. E in questo modo controlla il mercato, controlla l'economia.
The warnings from Italy resonate strongly with the man who led Australia's biggest mafia bust.
What we've seen is that these groups are very difficult to defeat. They regroup, they rebound, they reorganise, they have the international connections, which I think is a crucial part of the way they'll continue to operate. There's no question that Italian organised crime, Calabrian organised crime in this case, will continue. They will reorganise and they'll continue to conduct unlawful activity, drug importations, white-collar crime, because it's their business.
Late on Friday, we were advised by the Victorian branch of the Labor Party that it has moved to expel Michael Tetty from the party. Labor MP Kelvin Thompson has told us Tetty only worked in his office for 1 month and he had no idea of Tetty's mafia connections and supports his expulsion. Tetty declined to be interviewed for the program, but through his lawyers has denied any wrongdoing and said his relationship with Frank Modafferi was professional. Next week on Four Corners, 10 years after the suicide bombings that rocked London, survivors and their rescuers recount that dramatic day and its aftermath. Until then, good night.